welcome, and thank you for joining me on this beginner photographer online workshop. So thank you very much. It's great to have you here with me. Now, this first video is just a bit of an outline as to what we're actually going to get through and achieve in this online course. Now, this course is aimed at beginner photographers, and it's all about getting to know your camera. And even before you take a photo, there's things that you need to know about your camera in order to be able to take the camera. And these things may sound a little bit silly, like how to turn it on, how to change settings, how to view images and things like that. So that's the first thing that you really need to do, is have a look at the manual. Now, guys, I know most people get the manual and it's thick, it's 500, it's 1,000 pages, depending on the model camera. You might not even get the manual with it if it's a hand-me-down, which is great. There's no problem in that. But you'll find most manuals these days are online. You can just Google the brand of camera, Google the model, and you'll find a manual. So you need to know the basics about your camera. Don't get overly technical. It doesn't really matter the processor that it uses, how many megapixels and things like that. You do need to know a little bit technical as to whether it's full sensor or crop sensor. It probably doesn't mean much to you at the moment, but it will come into things later on down the track. Get to know what lenses you have, whether it's one lens, two lenses, and just the name of the lens. And again, that won't mean much to you at the moment, but down the track it will. It'll all start to mean something. So once you've started to get a little bit of that information, the main thing is you need to know how to turn your camera on, where the battery is, how to charge the battery, how to have a full battery, the memory cards, what type of memory card does it take, what type does it need. Now, memory cards are not all alike. They sound alike, but they're not. One thing you'll learn with photography is to buy quality. Now, you can jump online and buy all sorts of stuff here, there, and everywhere, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. So tip number one, I guess, is buy quality. And I know budgets are tight at the moment and we don't have a lot of money to spare, but just spend a couple of extra dollars and buy a quality memory card, quality batteries and things like that. So from there, what else do you need to do? Well, you need to know a few of the settings and dials and buttons on your camera. You need to know how to change the shutter, the aperture, the ISO, metering, and also just your way around where these buttons are, whether it's left or it's right. Don't panic about what you're actually changing. That doesn't really matter at this stage. That's what I'm here to teach you. That's what you're here to learn, what all these buttons and dials do. But if you can get an understanding of where the buttons are, how to change them, because sometimes you've got to push two buttons to change it or go through a menu and change it. And that's it. For lesson number one, just become a little bit familiar with your camera. As I say, know the basics about it, read the manual a little bit, and have a play. And that's it. So that's the end of lesson one. So now that you've watched that, I'm glad you've got this far. We're going to have some fun. We're going to learn some good stuff down the track through the rest of these videos. At the end, click complete video and go on to the next video, and we're going to start having a little bit of fun right there. I will see you in the next video. As I say, I hope you've got something out of this already. Let's get going. Let's get you off auto and on to manual. Understanding exposure triangle. Now, what's the exposure triangle? Well, that's three components of photography that all come together to give you the perfect exposed image. What's a perfectly exposed image? Well, that's up to your interpretation, but essentially the perfectly exposed image is the brightness, darkness of the image, how you want it. So hopefully you've been playing with your camera by now and you've changed a few settings and you've seen that you get really bright images and some really dark images. Well, we're going to help you find that middle ground where everything's nicely exposed. You can see everything that you want to see. So lesson 3 today is ISO. So ISO is a measurement of the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera. And I'll break that down a little bit for you. So the sensor is an electronic gizmo. That's all you need to know. At the back of your camera that converts the light that we see coming into our cameras to electronic data, that digital image. So we need something to go from light to electronics. And that's the sensor. In the old days, it was the film. Film would be exposed, revealed to the light, and the light would affect the film and give us our image. Well, now we do it electronically. And that's all it is. That's the sensor. Now, the ISO is a measurement of the sensitivity of the sensor. So how sensitive is it to light? And it has numbers. For those of you converting from film, ISO is essentially the same as the old ASA. It's an international standard. ASA is a standard as well. So we had film of 200, 400, maybe 800 ASA. Well, in the digital world, we can go from an ISO of 64, 100, 200, right up to big numbers of 25,000 or more. But without getting too technical, all that means is the higher the number, the more sensitive that sensor is to light. So if you're shooting in a dark environment, you need to make that sensor more sensitive to light so it captures every little bit of light coming in to your camera. If you're outside on a really bright sunny day, you don't need the sensor so sensitive because there's a lot of light. So you push that number down to about 200 generally in the outside world. That's a great starting point. Now, as a bonus to this, there is a worksheet on sensor on the ISO. You can download that from this page as well. But essentially, what we're talking about is how we capture and hold the light. By changing the sensitivity of that light, we're pumping more electricity into that sensor and making it more delicate, I suppose, to light. We take electricity away, it becomes more relaxed, it doesn't react to so much light. Just think of it as a little pad, little gizmo at the back of your camera with buckets. And those buckets are capturing the light. If you want more light, up the ISO, up the number, those buckets become bigger, they capture more light. And that's it. That's ISO, that's the sensor in your camera. And from there, we're going to now build on other components of aperture and shutter speed to come up with the understanding the exposure triangle. So again, at the end of this video, hit the completed button down below, download the worksheet for yourself. Now, I've done the worksheets in pretty much black and white to save color ink, make it quick and easy for you. Download them, have a little bit of a read, and again, go out and start shooting. Start playing with your camera and experimenting with changing the ISO. Aperture. Now, aperture is a really weird, confusing, conflicting subject when it comes to photography, particularly when you're starting out. So hopefully by now you've played with your camera and you've found the button and the dial to change your aperture, or f-stop as it's also known. So what is the aperture? The aperture is actually a part in your lens that opens and closes and controls the amount of light coming through your lens to your sensor. So we're starting to build up the exposure triangle right here. Now, you do need to know that aperture is a whole lot of physics and science as to how and why it actually works. As a beginner photographer, really all you need to know is what the end result is by doing something in particular. So we'll step through this and hopefully it becomes very clear. There is a worksheet that you can download, and like everything else, the more you practice, the more you will understand. So f-stop or aperture. As I say, it controls how much light comes through your lens. It also affects the depth of field, which is how much of your photo is sharp, how much is in focus, whether it's a small section about the size of this microphone or whether it's a landscape photo where from basically your toes right to the horizon is sharp and in focus. So let's work through this clearly so that we can get an understanding. Now, on most cameras that most beginners start with, an low f-stop is f4, f5.6. On some cameras or some lenses, it does go lower. 2.8, 1.2. They're very low. But on most cameras for beginners, it's f4, f5.6. Now, that low number means it is a bigger aperture. It's actually opening the aperture up to allow a lot more light into your camera. But it also means there's a lot less in focus. Okay? So if we're shooting in poor light, we want a small number, which gives us a bigger aperture to let more light in. Okay? So where do we use a small aperture? Generally speaking, if you're doing portrait photography or shooting an event and you're shooting people, you'd have an aperture of 5.6. That's a good starting point, maybe 7.1, and that gives just the person in focus. But you also need to balance other settings, the ISO and shutter speed, to get a well-exposed image, okay? On the reverse of that, a high aperture number, so f11, f22 is a very high aperture number. It's a very small aperture. It's letting a lot less light in. But it is also giving us more depth of field, more in focus. So there's a little bit of juggling when it comes to picking your f-stop as to how much light do you want in, how much do you want in focus, do you want to just isolate the person from everything behind them, or are you shooting a landscape and you want everything in focus, the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Basically, your toes, the river, the mountains, horizon. Do you want it all in focus? If you do, you'd be shooting at f11 upwards, okay? So, as I say, it is very confusing, but practice makes perfect. So, a low f-stop is a larger aperture and more light coming in, but less depth of field. A high aperture, a high f-stop, is a small aperture. It restricts the amount of light coming in, but more is in focus. So again, the best way is practice makes perfect. Get out there and shoot and practice the different settings and see what you like and how it works. Okay? Best of luck on all of that. Again, yes, I know it's confusing and there is a whole lot of physics behind it and theory. Now's not the time to go into it. If you do have questions, reach out to me, message me. More than happy to answer your questions. Shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is the third component of the exposure triangle, the other two being aperture and ISO, which we've already covered. So what is shutter speed and how does it affect our photos? Well, the shutter is a little curtain inside your camera that sits between the sensor and your lens. And the curtain opens for a predetermined amount of time to allow the light to travel through your lens and reach the sensor. and that is shutter speed. It's that little curtain. Now, shutter speed is measured in fractions of seconds, up to seconds, and sometimes minutes in some photography. By choosing the right shutter speed, you're choosing the amount of light you want to reach, but it also has an impact on the image and the subject that you're shooting. As I say, shutter speed can be measured in fractions of seconds. Some cameras will open up that curtain for 1/4,000th of a second. So it's very, very quick, open, close. And what that does is it freezes any movement. Anything that's moving while the shutter is open is frozen. Now that can go all the way down to half a second or a second, 5 seconds. So the longer that curtain is open, if something is moving, you will get a little bit of blur on that subject. And you'll see that in sports photos. If they have a slow shutter and they actually move with, for example, a race car, the race car stays focused and nice and sharp, but the background can become blurry. And it's a really good effect. Also, a lot of my landscape photos I shoot on long exposure, so the shutter is open for a long time, and that's how I get the silky, smooth water on waterfalls and in the rivers. The other side, when you're shooting sport, quite often football, you want to freeze the action. You don't want the players moving when they're kicking the ball or goalkeeper diving for the ball or a try being scored. So quite often you're shooting at 1/1000th or maybe 1/2000th of a second. The shutter's open and close before you realise it. Now, doing that, you're also limiting the amount of light hitting your sensor. So what you need to do is balance aperture and ISO to get a well-exposed photo. And that's the exposure triangle, everything coming together, which we'll talk about more. So now go out and just shoot, changing the shutter speed of your photos and see the end result. You can put your camera on a tripod and have something move through with it open for a long time, or freeze the action and see how it affects the subject. It also does actually have an effect on depth of field as well. So you may see that depending on what you're shooting. But overall, you will see a change in sharpness of the photo as well as the exposure. So go out, get shooting, and play with those settings. Exposure triangle. Now we're going to put everything that we've learned together. We've spoken about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed independently. Well, now we're going to talk about them together. They are individual components of photography, but they all interact and affect each other when it comes to getting the perfect exposure of our photos. Now, if you change one setting, it affects the exposure value, the overall brightness, darkness of the image. To compensate changing that, you can change another setting to compensate to come back to the brightness or darkness of the image that we want. And it's a matter of balancing. Now, when I say balance, we're not after a perfect equilateral triangle. The analogy of a triangle is simply the fact that there's 3 components, ISO, aperture, shutter, and they rely on each other. So if you change one setting, it affects the others. If you don't balance them, you don't end up with a triangle. You'll end up with a gap at the corners, for example, or a line going further than the triangle. And that has an effect on your photo. Usually it will deteriorate the quality or deteriorate what you actually represent. For example, if you don't balance it and your shutter is too slow, your subject will be moving in the photo and it will be blurry and it's a no good shot. If your shutter is fast, but your aperture is too restrictive, you don't get enough light in, it will be a dark image, but your subject will be frozen, which is what you want. So it's all about the balance. You need to find that balance. Now, as I say, it's not an equilateral triangle. You change one setting, you change one or two of the others. The tip here is not to change everything at once. Change one setting, particularly as you're a beginner. Change one setting at a time. Because if you change two settings, you don't know which setting change affected the photo positively or negatively. So go one setting at a time, okay? Have an idea of what you're after. If you're shooting sport, the kids playing soccer or football or athletics, generally you want a very fast shutter. So start there. If you're shooting a portrait, well, generally you only want the subject, the portrait, the person in focus, not so much the background. So you're going to have a shallow depth of field. Your f-stop would be about 5.6 is a good starting level for portraits. You then dial in the rest of your settings. Let's stick with the portrait. If it's an inside portrait, well, it's 5.6. The person is stationary, so around 1/200th, 1/250th, for example, shutter speed. Because the person's not moving, that's a good shutter speed. You then play with the ISO, pushing it up if you're inside to get a well-exposed photo. With those same two settings, f-stop of 5.6, shutter speed of 1/200th or 1/250th, go outside and see how you have to turn the ISO down. You will still get a good exposure. If you push the ISO right down and it's overexposed, increase the shutter so that you're restricting the time that the light hits the sensor. As I keep saying, photography is all about doing. So get out there, try these settings, practice balancing the exposure, practice balancing the exposure triangle and see how you go. As always, if you've got questions, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help.